Oh, hello, yeah. Well, the nights are drawing in. Oh, I said that yesterday, didn't I? Anyway, they still are. Yes. Anyway, it's very good news today to see, America sort of flexing its imperial muscle somewhat, with Argentina. I mean, they had promised to bail out the Argentine economy, but apparently it's dependent upon the Argentinians voting the right way, because nothing says you're allowed to do whatever you want with somebody basically holding a sort of, dollars above you one way or another. Yes, you can vote any way you like, but Donald Trump's choice will get in. I'm surprised they're not suggesting sending gunboats. Empires always end up looking the same, don't they? Except, of course, empires also end the same, and they end up with the same basic problems. European countries, a lot of them, are marked by their empires. I mean, France has a large Algerian population, mark of its empire. You can think about the Americans themselves with all those waves of migrants, be they German or British or Irish or, Jewish for that matter, yeah? Waves of people coming there that sort of, one way or another muddle through in a country. I mean, there is this sort of vague notion about America being this cultural melting pot, but I don't know, it's quite debatable, isn't it? You think about the way that someone like Joe Biden will describe himself as being Irish, despite the fact that, I don't know how Irish he is in real terms. Yes. And of course, with Britain, we have the empire, the legacy of empire. One of the reasons why we have so many different people in the UK now is that legacy of us going out in the world, maybe with our gunboats and our metaphorical dollars, demanding that people do what we want. Which is the reason why there are so many different types of us here. But that leads to all sorts of problems, of course, with people not really kind of getting that or being cross about it. And, I have noticed over the years that people get very, very frothy at the idea of there being such a thing, distinctly something as being British, or indeed distinctly something as being English, because when you try and nail it down, it sort of, wriggles away from you a bit like jelly, if I can kind of mix that metaphor up slightly. Anyway, we had this from Philip Johnson in yesterday's Telegraph. What is it to be British? We cannot live harmoniously until we find an answer. In an era of multiculturalism and profound segregation, we have failed to expound the defining characteristics of the nation. Yes, it has been attempted in the past. Various people have tried to come up with working definitions, and it's very, very hard to do so. And as far as I'm concerned, I just think to myself, I'm not entirely sure what the value is, whether or not we can define something that is quintessentially English as opposed to quintessentially Welsh or Scottish or indeed anything else. Now, what Philip does in this piece is he manages succinctly not to answer his own question. So let's just read at the end of his article here. This was a country that once took pride in not being prone to overt displays of patriotism or oath-taking. American children are still expected to recite a pledge of allegiance to their country and flag every morning at school. Which is a hangover from the 1950s. It was a big anti-communist thing. It doesn't go back that far, which some people don't know. Anyway, this would be seen as very un-British if required here, and yet as the recent upsurge of Union and St George's flags in England has indicated, there is a latent desire among the population, including immigrants wishing to be British, to demonstrate their Britishness. We just have to work out what it is. Tricky, isn't it? Because we can't. And therefore I might suggest that, maybe we just shouldn't. Because, I don't know, all of us contain those little histories amongst ourselves, which will, inevitably have a certain level of DNA mixed up with them, if I can put it that way. I mean, I can remember sort of growing up in southeast London in the 1960s with that kind of very much that sort of first kind of windrushy wave of people that were coming over. But there were still people that were here that I grew up amongst that preceded that. There was quite a large Irish segment to the people I lived around, and they were slightly different from you and me, if you like, if I can put it that way. The English, if I can put it that way. I know, you see, I get struggle with these terms as well, but they were Irish, and in those days the Irish were a figure of fun because the mix were all a bit, silly, weren't they? Yes. And that was a standard sort of thing, maybe until Dave Allen came along and knocked that a little bit on the head. But there was that distinct sense that these people were, like us, and it was fine, but they kind of weren't like us because they were from over there and not from here. There was a level of discrimination associated with that as well. And I can remember as well growing up amongst like Anglo-Indian people, and by that I meant that sort of original 19 sort of post-colonial view of that, of many people that were here of very mixed, British or English descent, as well as being mixed Indian descent as well. I can think of at least a couple of people just a few houses away from me where I was living in Penge in southeast London that were like that. They were, again, there was that kind of vague sense which I'm only aware of now as an adult, but looking back on it, there was this sense of slight otherness that was going on with that. And of course, now we have this other sense of otherness, which Philip goes into in his article, because he very much others Muslims as being separate and segregated and not really mixing in. But I can again remember, though, the kids that I grew up with, those black kids I grew up with, who were the children of that kind of Windrush generation, who were seen as being separate. They kept to themselves. You didn't want to go to Brixton because it was way too dangerous. Oh, no, it was full of all those black kids who, of course, would be blamed with mugging and rioting later on. But now, generally speaking, it seems like an awful lot of people really don't have any problems with these people at all, because, magically they have become British in ways that they weren't in the 60s or 70s, yeah? It's strange. And I don't know, but if you can't define a certain particular characteristic of people, maybe you shouldn't try. Or maybe you just shouldn't get so het up about what exactly it might mean. Because after all, we are, all of us, simply products of human beings that have roamed around the planet for a very long period of time. Now, there's different cultures and everything else, and you can argue the toss about whether one culture is better than another. But by God, I meet an awful lot of people that have got the same cultural heritage as me, and I certainly don't think they're superior to others. I don't think particularly I'm superior to others. I meet an awful lot of different people that I know are an awful lot better, in inverted commas, than I am. So I'm not going to get hung up about it, and I don't see why other people should either. And I don't really see why people should, want to wrap themselves in a flag that essentially has no meaning for them other than, hey, we're all here and we're all in this together. And maybe that's as good as it should get. We should just have a level of empathy about the fact that life is tough and maybe we should work together. Anyway, do have a lovely day. Stay warm.